Today, we are launching our annual media monitoring report. We've done this for several years, and this year we took a specific focus on climate policy rollbacks in the Canadian media. We've seen major policy changes, and we wanted to know how these stories and decisions are appearing in the national media. The core question that we also asked and have in the previous years is where is climate in today's media stories and what's missing from the public conversation? I have no problem thinking of many stories that have unfolded over the last year between Hollywood burning down and tragic floods and more than 7.3 million hectares in the north of Canada were on fire, which incidentally is about the size of New Brunswick. And so we're just curious what broke through, and also in the current conversations around energy, where is climate in that? So once again, we've got an amazing panel of folks here, and we'll hear first from our two primary researchers, one Chris Hatch and Ghadah Alrasheed. So Chris currently works as a strategic communications consultant on energy and climate change. He's the former executive editor for the National Observer and was previously the executive director of the Rainforest Action Alliance or Network. Chris has a background in campaigns and strategic communications on clean energy, climate change, human rights, and environmental issues, and has worked with NGOs, First Nations, foundations, governments, and corporations. He also authors Canada's top climate newsletter, Zero Carbon, where Chris sorts through news, ideas, politics, and culture to figure out what's working in the race against climate change. And Chris, I believe this is the third year we've done this together. So also he's one of our key voices in terms of presenting this material. The next panelist and also the lead researcher on the project is our own Ghadah Alrasheed. She's the resource and training director at Re.Climate. She leads our research, knowledge mobilization, and the development of resources, evidence-based tools, and training program for Re.Climate's network of organizations and 4,500 climate influencers with a PhD in communications and a wealth of experience spanning academic, federal, and NGO sectors. She brings a unique understanding of effective research and knowledge mobilization practices in climate communications. And so, Ghadah, I believe that this is also the third year for you on this particular report. So awesome. They will also be joined after they present the results with panelists, including Hanna Morris. So Hanna is an assistant professor at the School of Environment at the University of Toronto and co-chair of the Critical Studies of Climate, Media, Discourse, and Power Working Group as a part of Brown University's Climate Social Science Network. Her research concentrates on the climate media democracy nexus and explores the critical questions of power and media making around climate change. And her newest book is entitled Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, Climate Crisis, Media and Power. And that's out with Oxford University Press this year. So welcome, Hanna. And then finally, they will be joined in the panel discussion with Brent Jolly, who's the president of the Canadian Association of Journalists and the managing director of the National News Media Council of Canada. And he is also a freelance reporter and editor. So welcome, everyone. And I will now hand it over to Chris and Ghadah to walk us through the research findings and key recommendations. So over to you, Chris.
Thank you, Amber. So just to set the stage, it's almost hard to know these days what media even means. And what we're talking about here today is what's often referred to as the legacy media. So, and specifically the legacy media working in English. So we're not covering social media, independent media, francophone broadcast media, or regional media, things like podcasts. And one of the reasons is just because we wanted to take a specific focus on policy, which the big traditional legacy media obviously plays a key role in shaping that debate, and lands on the desks of politicians every morning, that kind of thing. And basically what we do, there's two things. One is a high level review where we're taking all of the coverage that's out there from the outlets we selected and do searches looking for linkages. How often is climate mentioned? How often is it mentioned in conjunction with wildfires? Those kind of questions. And then we take a random sample of 100 um, um, stories, in this case about climate policy, discard the ones that don't make any sense, and literally comb through in person looking for the frames and narratives that are most common. So let's get into it. If we go to the next slide, just to say off the top that, of course, there are lots of great reporters out there, but that in aggregate, what we find is that coverage that talks about climate almost invariably ignores the causes and consequences of climate change. And when it comes to policy, mostly ignores the need for specific policy, its purpose, or its effectiveness. Broadly speaking, climate change is sort of like, we call it a mid-sized topic. It's kind of in and around mental health, much, much smaller than housing or the economy. Even, lately, artificial intelligence, immigration have surpassed climate in terms of volume of coverage. Generally speaking, we don't find much sort of climate denier stuff or even both sidesism anymore in the big legacy media, with the notable exceptions of the post media outlets, National Post, Financial Post, and their opinion sections. But what we do find is that while climate coverage was increasing into the last couple of years, it has dropped off this year. Not only has the volume dropped off, but the narratives have shifted to be talking about a decline in public priority, a narrative around rollbacks in climate policy, and sort of an ongoing assumption that there's an economic necessity in our current circumstances for delaying climate action. On to the next. Climate coverage ignores the climate, mostly framed as a political matter. So it's talked about in terms of policies, it's talked about by politicians in the media. And what you see on this slide is that well less than half the time is there any mention of anything to do with climate science, even less to do with the impacts. So what this is showing really is the way that climate coverage really ignores the consequences of climate change. And on the next slide, we move to the way in which it ignores the causes of climate change. So as everyone on this webinar, I'm sure knows, the vast bulk of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels. But when climate change is mentioned in the national media, only around 10% of the time does it mention the cause. And the next slide shows the inverse, which is that when we are talking about fossil fuels, less than 80% of the time do those energy stories even make mention of climate. And as you'll probably know from following the media, often when it does, it's in terms of, we might miss our climate targets, as if this were some kind of a game of darts or reporting on a corporate earnings report or something like that. On the next slide, just in summary, you probably know the saying that communication without context is just noise. And that's a lot of what we have found. So there's just not context or meaning in the coverage, in the sense that of the negative context of accelerating climate change and impacts, the fact that we're barreling past the 1.5 degree limit with all that means for coral reefs and ice sheets and storms and the rest of it. Context around actual and ongoing increase in fossil fuel burning and extraction, or how Canada fits in terms of these various metrics relative to other countries. And on the flip side, positive context is typically missing. So the state of clean energy deployment around the world, trends in electrifying transport and buildings, and how Canada is progressing relative to other jurisdictions, or the economic and health benefits of decarbonization. So in the next slide, looking specifically at extreme events like fires and floods, this is the one place where the national media is doing markedly better from past years, actually. Not strangely in the case of wildfires. So what we do here is we take all the wildfire stories and we discard the ones that are really about alerts and evacuations and things where you wouldn't expect a reporter to get into the causes and consequences. They're just trying to do a public service story. And only about 18% of wildfire coverage even makes any mention of climate change, which is roughly on par to previous years. In the case of floods and extreme heat, though, we found a marked improvement. This is almost 20 points higher than it was even last year, doubling of the linkages between floods and extreme heat and climate change. On the next slide, slightly less good news. When it comes to the health impacts of these extreme events, still quite low percentage of coverage. So extreme heat, for example, only a quarter of the stories about heat waves warn about the health impacts. For wildfire smoke, surprising to me actually, only about 13% of stories about smoke give any information about the health impacts of smoke, which are, as you probably know, much worse than we had realized even a few years ago. When we move on, so we've switched over now to looking at policies in particular, how our climate policies and climate policy rollbacks covered. And this really jumped out of the sort of fine-grained analysis that we did, is that when you go through coverage of things like the carbon tax, the industrial carbon price, emissions cap, all these kind of policies that are live issues, they are 3 times as likely to be discussed in terms of how much they will cost the country, cost consumers, that kind of thing, as there is to have any mention of any economic opportunities or benefits, and over 10 times more likely to be presented as costly as to have any mention at all about the costs of not having action on climate change. On the next slide, we look at how often climate policies are even discussed in any context of climate change itself. This is quite odd, actually, when you think about it. We're talking about policies without mentioning the problem that they're trying to solve, which is unusual even for any issue. It's as if the media was covering housing policies without mentioning the need for more housing, the cost of housing, cost of rent, that kind of thing. So, for example, when they're talking about the industrial carbon price, that on the far right, less than 25% of the time, less than a quarter of the time, is it even mentioned that this is a policy that's meant to tackle climate pollution or address climate change. And we think that this is important in the same way that not mentioning fossil fuels in the context of climate change is. If coverage doesn't address the causes and the consequences, it really does hamper the public's ability to develop a mental picture, a mental model of what the problem is, and therefore, come to our own conclusions about what needs to be done about it. On the next slide, you'll see that these are the most common voices: politicians, industry spokespeople, and government agencies by far and away lead over any independent sort of analysis. And you'll see there that scientists and academics who could speak to the causes and consequences are very unlikely to get into the coverage. On the next slide, we're looking at which policies get the most attention. Through the whole first half of this year, the carbon tax absolutely dominated coverage. And on the next slide, these are the solutions that get the most attention. Electric vehicles is, as it has been for several years, by far and away bigger than anything else. To the extent that clean energy is discussed, it's discussed in the abstract when they're actually talking about wind or solar, batteries, that kind of thing. Far less frequently mentioned in any tangible way. And as you can see, the media is more likely to talk about hydrogen than it is any of those specific tangible solutions. Nature conservation coming in, very low, as you can see on that chart. And then if we move to the next one, I think this is the last one we're going to look at. It's just kind of interesting that the industry-led solutions get twice as much linkage to climate change. So they're framed as a climate change solution twice as frequently as clean energy or electric vehicles. And, so it also goes to the point that the things over which people have some agency are far less frequently presented, framed as climate change solutions. And with that, I am going to hand it over to Ghadah to talk about the recommendations and other contexts.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. And before I go into the recommendation, I want to really take a moment to acknowledge the work of the people who are not on screen today, but who have contributed to this work, especially Dr. Emma Bider, our program coordinator, who has helped with the research for this report, and also Dr. Chris Russell, whose feedback was really helpful, but they are also in the chat and the Q&A. And please feel free to send any questions for this report there, which we will tackle either in the chat or here. So just, I want to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about the media environment we were working on. And this year, we continue to focus on legacy media in our annual monitoring of national media. And for the reasons that Chris had just mentioned, but also is I want to add is that the topic itself has made us do that decision of focusing on national media, for the reason is that journalists in national media have or carry the responsibility of educating people about policies and educating policy, or taking policymakers accountable for for the decisions or their rollback. So it made sense to begin with these outlets. But also we know that the landscape is changing and is going to keep changing. And in making sense of that change, we also included alongside the climate coverage coverage analysis, which Chris has just gone over, we also reviewed research that looked at the Canadian media landscape in 2025, including reports on local media, studies from the Media Ecosystem Observatory, the review of CBC by the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, the Echo Analytics recent report, and social networks. And by the way, these are all included in the chat here, and they are included in the report. So we looked to make a sense of what is going on because we wanted to kind of respond to this tension between what people, some people say that, well, it's, things are happening, people on social, this is where we should pay our attention to. And then the other kind of voice, which is, which is really arguing that the online space is too chaotic. So what we need is journalism that needs to be rooted in trusted outlets, in real work. So there's this, a bit of tension, and we did this review to have a preliminary understanding of that media landscape. And what emerged from that review is that we are working really with a multi-layered system, each with strengths and challenges and also implications for climate communicators and the ways we think about how we work and we communicate. So this slide really tries to simplify and capture what is a more complex and nuanced and shifting landscape, but it's just like an overview of what are the main media systems we are working with. So the first one is the legacy media, and outlets like CBC, CTV, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and Global News still rank among the most trusted news sources in Canada. Yes, this trust has been declining, but what we have seen in the recent research that these sources are still credible for millions of Canadians. And research actually shows that people who spend more time on traditional media, on news, they are better protected against misinformation. And I'm talking here about, misinformation like climate change is not happening, or climate change is natural, or or 15-minute cities are designed for surveillance. But of course, this doesn't mean that the coverage is missing. And Chris has just gone over all these issues and contexts that are missing in the coverage. But at the same time, I think it's just that given that the trust is there, we need really to pay attention to the media landscape and still maintain it. And another fact is that the audience for traditional media is also changing. Younger Canadians are shifting from these platforms to podcasts, social platforms, and creator-driven content for news and information. So that's another limitation of legacy media. Now, for the other media system is the local news, and it has really unique role, especially during emergencies, during wildfires, evacuations, and elections. People want local news during these moments, but it's also a sector that is disappearing fast and shrinking than any other part of these media system. Even the Canadian population are growing, and this leaves huge gaps, especially in suburban areas and in some provinces. But many Canadians still want local news. Actually, 70% of Canadians said in a survey that more local news would have helped them make better decisions about, their voting during election. So people want it. And then the other media system is the social media. We know, of course, that people are in social media, but not just for news. They get news and information mixed with entertainment, parenting, sport, lifestyle content. And we know also that many people engage with environmental organizations and environmental individuals online. And the research by Dr. Tyndall shows that the more exposure actually someone has to these voices, to environmental voices online, they are more likely to engage with climate and be active in the climate space. But then, of course, there's fragmentation, and it's created a fragmentation in how we get the information. And this fragmentation, interestingly, is not just happening within platforms, but also between flat platforms. So, for example, X skews more conservative, while TikTok tends to appeal to younger and more progressive audiences. And there's also low trust. People don't, when you ask them, at least they say, we don't trust Facebook, we don't trust X, we don't trust, and that's the majority of what they report. So that is an issue. That's also a dimension that we need to consider when we interact with this media. And the last, media system is independent media. And examples of these would be the National Observer, the TAI, the Norwal. And these outlets really offer in-depth reporting, investigative reporting. They offer really good climate stories, but they are not getting the visibility that larger or other larger outlets get. So where to go from there? Given what Chris has just covered and what I've also quickly captured here in this slide, is one important work that we need to do is to work on the few public understanding gaps, and these gaps, we also see them in media coverage. So we need to do work to narrow these gaps. The first gap is the perception gap. Many people underestimate how others care about climate change, how others support climate action. So it helps to bring that context back and make it visible to show that most Canadians actually are concerned and most support climate action. And this will likely get them more to act on climate. The other gap is the confusion around the cause of climate change. We need content that connects the impact of a climate change to the cause. And speaking here specifically about the burning of fossil fuels, and this is a huge gap, as which Chris has shown in his presentation in the media coverage, and also it shows up in our public opinion roll-up research and the research that Dr. Louise Comeau has conducted as well last year, which shows that really people are not getting the main source of carbon emissions. And so there's a need to be more awareness around this. Another public understanding gap is really the thing is that we are in the country, we're doing what we should be doing and we're doing enough. And then the counter argument of what about China, what about other countries, and this comes up often. So we need to show how Canada compares to other countries in emissions, in clean energy investments, in policy efforts. And in the slide, these are some of the useful trackers that communicators and journalists can use really to track climate policies in Canada and in around the world, but also to track emissions globally. And finally, the solutions feel unrealistic. Even when people want climate action, sometimes they feel that this is something not doable. So these international comparison shows that the world is actually moving toward cheaper, clean electricity. So it shows the momentum, and and it's something that we can do as well. Um, the second set of work that we need to do is that NGOs and institutions and organizations need to support journalists to cover climate change more clearly and with context. And they can do this by, one, making data easy to scan or easy to insert in the story by providing explainers, briefs, charts that journalists can easily use, and it saves them hours of reading through reports. Also, pitch, we tend to think about local outlets as the main outlets that we want to pitch our stories to, but we need to do more work to pitch to local outlets. And anecdotally, lots of these stories have been picked up when they were published in local outlets, and this kind of work really supports these local outlets in their work. And then the third type of work that we need to support journalists and reporters is to guide them to resources, because they often struggle to find who they can speak to. So getting them connected to frontline workers, to local voices, to trusted messenger helps them do this work as well, and strengthen their climate coverage. And then also the work that we need is that to think about the frames. Right now, there is imbalance in how climate is talked about. We hear a lot about the cost of a climate solution, but not much about the cost of climate inaction, the opportunities and returns that come from renewable projects and local climate solutions. So we need to bring these pieces back into the conversations, and this means is really where we should be asking simple, fair questions of, like, how much do we pay when climate impacts get worse? What are taxpayers already spending on an oil and gas project? What could we gain if we put the same investment into solar or wind and other renewable projects? And finally, is just again, is like the media landscape has changed, and we really need formats that actually fit this environment. Short explainers, visuals, content that people can share in their groups and in online spaces. And it doesn't have all to come from organizations, but it really, or journalists, but it can, one path forward is partnership with content creators who already have trust and audience, and they can be supported in carrying parts of the story in their own way. And the other way is to train people who are experts or trusted to be more on media, and so that they can be a media spokesperson. And I will end it here, and I'll hand it to you, Amber.
Thank you, Ghadah. Very rich results. And I can see that there are a few questions coming in the Q&A. So I encourage people to ask your questions. We'll have some time on the other side of the panel discussion to get to audience questions in real time. But to kick us off, Hanna, I'm going to go to you first. The report really did cover both sense that climate is missing from the conversation, and also that when it is covered, the focus is on darkening narratives. So policy rollbacks, decline in public priority, and the economic necessity of delay. And so I know that a lot of your work is thinking about this. And so I wanted to hand it over to you and just from your perspective, what are the consequences of this erasure of climate from the energy conversation or just of climate?
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be a part of this panel, first of all, and really important work. I really learned a lot from the report, and it's important and really reveals a lot. And so, to answer your question, I just want to stress how hard it is to be a journalist right now. And, in terms of in the report showing declines in public trust, cuts in resources, concentration of ownership that are leading to loss of jobs. And this is happening, the report, really focused on also a really consequential time period of when Trump was first elected or inaugurated, and he expressed threats, of course, to Canada, including tariffs, but also, threatening invasion. And so journalists trying to figure out how to cover that in addition to these wider contexts of it being really hard being a journalist right now. And so I think that it led to sort of assuming along kind of elite generated narratives that people it's sort of a reactionary moment where maybe people are way more concerned about their day-to-day economic lives. There's not enough space to think about climate anymore with all that's going on in the world and threats to Canada, and sort of assumed that there was a loss of interest in climate change, which actually wasn't accurate. And a lot of, work that you have done and other polls around the world are showing consistently large majorities of people are concerned about climate change and want to do something about it. And so I think the consequences of assuming that people have lost that interest and that doesn't fit into thinking about these wider political conversations is sort of inaccurate in some ways. And ways to get around that, I think, which was you just closed with, is really expanding who to talk to. And instead of it just being elite narratives, which are easier to access, that are primary definers and defining what the problem of climate change is, how to respond, really trying to talk to those 89% of people that are consistently saying that they care and they want to do something about climate change, and challenging this narrative that it's just assumed that people is not a top concern. And I was just at Climate Week in New York in September, and I was at the New York Times climate event, and a really striking statement. These are the climate reporters that were saying, it's not about climate politics anymore, it's about climate economics. And sort of assuming that, again, that people are really more concerned about economics around climate change, as opposed to fundamentally how to respond, how to think about different types of policies, how to make it more inclusive, more equitable. And so I think a consequence of this type of reporting too is losing that really important momentum that we had, for example, in 2019, 2018, around how to think about responding to climate change differently, more robustly, including more people. So I think I'll leave it there and hear what the other panelists think too.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I just wanted to take a moment here and also for you, Brent, same question. And I know, Hannah kind of opened it up a little bit in terms of some of the challenges that journalists are facing right now. And so, do you want to say a little bit more about kind of, your view on from where you sit, what your view is, and your sense of the pressures that journalists are facing that might be also leading to this. And maybe I'll be so bold as to also ask you what responsibility do they hold to ensure that climate is included?
Yeah, I mean, I think climate is one of the greatest existential questions of our time, and so it's a vitally important story to be covering. And full stop. That's a duty that we all bear, individually and collectively. That's within our agency to find out what's going on as journalists and to report on it. So, the problem is though that is becoming increasingly difficult, and I don't want to rewrite and reread sort of Hannah's brilliant responses from before. I just, do want to say that absolutely she's what I completely agree with what she's saying around, the challenges, and also sort of the framing around, economics and that. And so, that has a huge trickle down effect in the ability and capacity for journalists to actually spend the time needed on every individual story that could take days or weeks. I mean, some of my friends are climate correspondents at various news outlets in this country, and they're not on a daily deadline. They're not there turning around a 2-minute TV piece or, a 600-word news story. They're taking weeks and weeks to go different places, to talk to different people, to get outside of that sort of political bubble, that we talked about or were shown in the results around, who are the sources that are being consulted for these stories. And that takes an exceptional amount of time, and it takes an exceptional amount of resources that, for a whole bunch of reasons, which probably are outside the scope of this particular discussion, ultimately result in covering what Mark Carney says, or what Pierre Poilievre says, or what Danielle Smith says, and sort of getting a reaction to it, and turning it around for the next day's paper or for that evening's newscast. And that's not to say that that's a good way of doing things or a bad way of doing things. I think it's just sort of the current reality of where we are. And maybe if we're thinking about, where does our responsibility lie in terms of, figuring out and changing narratives and changing frames. Well, I think that, understanding that maybe that's one of the first hurdles that we're going to have to overcome.
Yeah, thank you. So Chris and Ghadah, you've had some airtime, but I just want to also give you a chance here to underscore any point that you think is really important we make now on this question of what are the consequences of erasing climate from the energy and impacts conversation. And then also similarly, what practically speaking from your point of view would you focus on as a response to that?
Well, I think in terms of practically speaking, for communicators, part of the job is to look at these specific gaps in context and try to fill them in terms of your own direct communication and providing information to reporters. I mean, one of the good sort of trends I think that we've seen lately is that in the international wire service world, you see a lot more now from Associated Press, Reuters, those kind of outlets where they just have, it's almost boilerplate language, so that in any kind of story that's about either energy or climate, whichever way you're leading in, there is also included, a few paragraphs about, fossil fuel burning being the cause of 75-90% of the problem, and then the impact. So if you're going to talk about missing targets, let's talk about coral going extinct, ice sheets melting, heat waves, storms, floods, that kind of thing. And that is possible to have inserted.
Yeah, thank you. Ghadah, anything to add?
I think just like I want to give an example here is that if you so in our analysis or in the sample that we have randomly selected, that sample was focused on policies that were rolled back and or at the risk of being rolled back at that time. And so again, it's like the political and the economic frame, and it's the point that Brent and Hanna has just raised of like, these are really dominating and they are really eliminating that context of climate. If, I can read a few headlines, for example, on the EV mandate, and these are headlines from the Globe and Mail, from CBC. And it's just, and we know that some people also actually stop at reading headlines than reading the articles. But these are the headlines. The real threat to Canadian auto isn't Trump, it's our government forcing EVs on us. EV mandates are well-intentioned, but not realistic. Ottawa should scrap restrictive EV regulations, says GM Canada. Again, different outlets, it's some news, some opinion pieces. And, reading these headlines as a reader, the main takeaway that you get is that EV mandate is a burden, it's an overreach, it's slowing our economy. And so that the whole context of why we need EV mandates is actually absent. So who's gonna take policymakers accountable when they roll back these, or the executive when they roll back these policies? It's just there's no understanding or public understanding of why we need these type of solutions. And so, because again, what Brent and Hanna just mentioned is that the economic frame has really, pushed out the climate element out of the conversation.
Yeah. And then I think also Hannah's point around the social mandate, or the kind of public levels of public concern, and the perception that people don't care, or I'm alone, is also lost in those kinds of headlines. So moving a little bit over now to the point that you had covered, Ghadah, around the shifting media environment. I'm curious, for the panelists here, what is the value of legacy media? So I know that after we kind of circle around this conversation a lot as communicators, and I'm going to go back to you, Hanna, first, and just curious what you have to say about the value of legacy media. There's also a question here of whether or not we call them corporate media, so you might want to add that in. And should we keep investing in that, and or do we need to rethink our approach?
Yeah, this is such an important question. Yeah, it's also getting back to our conversations we were just having, in terms of it being so hard to understand and to know what other people are thinking. So legacy media or corporate media, we know what the elite, level folks are thinking, because that's reflected in a lot of these headlines that you just were mentioning, leading in quotes, sort of the framing and the defining of climate change is now an economic primary, issue, as opposed to it being political. A lot of different ways to respond, needing a lot of different people to figure out how to respond. And then we have social media, which similarly is corporate, corporate social media, increasingly being bought and owned by fewer folks who are richer. So of course, Elon Musk buying Twitter, turning into X, and now TikTok, Larry Ellison and Mark Andreessen and folks from Silicon Valley, likely probably going to buy that too. And so it's going to be even harder using these spaces to understand what others are thinking, and to have this understanding, again, that 89% of people, according to poll after poll on in an international aggregate, really are concerned about climate change and want more comprehensive government action. But that same majority, according to lots of studies, for example, a really important one in Nature, we're saying that the same majority, vast majority of people don't think that others share that perspective. So there's clear breakage of social ties, and really difficult in current media landscape, legacy corporate media landscape, corporate social media space, to see and understand and to hear and to talk to people. And so I guess that's the case, I would say, for building a more robust public media system. So it has a counter to corporate, but I think that these, public media spaces are really important, and, having the ability to, if it's funded well, be able to talk to and talk to people that are currently excluded from corporate coverage, and really having a better sense of what people are thinking, and move the conversation in a more robust way around climate change. So that's my case for a stronger public media system, and the value of it, though. Traditional reporting is still important, and really needed in this time, but maybe
Yeah.
structure isn't the best.
Yeah, Brent, anything to add to that? It's hard to go after Hanna, I know.
Yeah, I know she just says everything that I'm thinking. So there we go. I'll come up with something interesting to say. I guess what I would say, I mean, sure. I mean, I think what we need to figure out is a couple of things. Like, how do we get away from this episodic framing that we have of climate stories, and into more thematic framing? That's something that is a time honored tradition, so we're not just looking at individual events. But I think, sort of what we have to think through also is what I'd like to see more of is more actual of journalism, reporting on things that talks to people, that goes out into communities, that gets away from, talking to elite sources like politicians and, industry, insiders and things like that, and actually does it. Because that's where I think that is where the evidence is, and how you unearth the evidence that actually convinces people that this is an issue. How is this impacting their own community? Why does this matter to them? And how do we ultimately, build off of this to demand better from our politicians and others? Because ultimately that's how politicians are not going to take this action proactively. They're going to respond to a demand for changes in policy, changes in society, and how to adapt to those. So I think that, in a lot of ways, opinion pieces are one way that a lot of places, talk about communicate, climate and environment related issues. But I think, the really important thing is to invest in journalism that actually goes out and talks to people and understands the issue from different perspectives, not from, a corner office in Toronto or Calgary, of perhaps, a fossil fuel organization or company.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, over to you, and then we'll move to some of the Q&A that people are asking now. Just curious, from your perspective, and as somebody who is thinking a lot about what's in the public space, through your work on your newsletter, what narratives and storylines do you believe urgently need to be more visible? So specifically, and that would really help to close this gap that we've been talking about in terms of perception or literacy, understanding, support, etc.
Well, I think that a lot does come back to helping folks build a picture of the problem and therefore the solutions to it. So I think is just fundamental, and it's something we've kind of skipped past in a certain way, is clarifying that this is not about emissions. This is about burning fossil fuels,
Yeah.
and so the whole energy debate as it happens in Canada, which is so much around oil and gas and pipelines and all of that, making that linkage that when we're talking about expanding, whether it's gas lines into homes or the oil and gas industry production itself, we're talking about worsening climate change, and making that connection really clear. I think that's really fundamental. And then I think the point that's come up a couple times now around social norms, like we're such social creatures, so social mammals, right? And so if we think other people don't care, we're gonna either adjust our own beliefs and care less, or at least kind of go turtle and just kind of hide from the issue psychologically. So I feel like breaking down those sort of misperceptions about the fact that everyone does care but no one's talking about it, super important.
Thank you. Ghadah, I'll come back to you in the specific Q&As. But for now, let's see what we have here. So we have a specific question here from Julie to Ghadah or Chris. Recent communications research, including from Re.Climate, suggests messaging about climate policies and programs should focus on relevant social benefits like jobs, health, affordability over climate. Are journalists picking up on this, which then reinforces the deprioritizing of climate first messaging? So what are we doing? Are we saying connect talk about people's daily lives and their daily concerns, or are we talking about climate? Can you say something? What's the advice here?
Well, I'll start from the second part of the question, is about our journalists picking up on this, and is that, and I think it does mean is that, are they connecting to these social benefits? definitely through like what Chris has just shared is that, for example, in the health, when it's really an important moment to mention the health impacts of wildfire smoke, that connection has not been really strong. And so, so picking up, I that we haven't seen that connection that is made. And that's the primary issue that we have found in the coverage, is that the connection is not made in this coverage. And because of that, climate is really siloed. It becomes an issue for those who have, or it seems as an issue for those who have time and luxury to think about it, because it's not linked to the other priorities that people have. So I would say is that is really, and this is something that I've seen also in the other part of the work, is that really the connection has not been made. So it would be great really to make these connections of how climate is impacting our health, how climate action is benefiting our health, how the wildfires and flood and so on impacting our economy, and climate inaction is costing us. And again, it's like, what benefits do these, do climate projects and solutions offer us?
Yeah.
So let's connect.
Yeah. So not one or the other, but both.
Yes.
Do both and do a better job at drawing the connections between climate change and the things that Canadians care about. Yeah.
Definitely.
Chris, anything to add? Or should I move on to another question?
Well, you can keep moving. I mean, I think generally, there's all different audiences and all different contexts. And it's, I don't think we should get too hung up on trying to find the one sort of silver bullet answer to any of these questions. It's a problem that sadly is going to be with us the rest of our children's lives. And it's a messy, muddy problem. And you just have to keep trying to find the ways in that make sense for the context that you're working with.
Awesome. Okay. Well, with that in mind, Sean has a question for all panelists. I'm going to start with you, Brent, first. What recommendations do you have about tone in climate-related stories? We've been told that negative stories about climate cause fear and paralysis. How do we talk about context without turning the audience off?
Yeah. I think one of the things I think is focusing on solutions, if I can be so bold as to say that, and sort of not get caught up in I think the sort of woe is us and the sky is falling and everything is going to end, that instills fear and elicits fear in people, in a fear-based response that doesn't allow them to actually think through, well, how can this be better? How can we do it? You sort of automatically, curl up in a, fetal cat-like position to try and, hold dear to what you have or what you currently, hope to keep. So I think giving people sort of the idea that, this is not, we're in a period of transition, and what does that transition look like? And who are the people who are doing it? Because I think that's how people understand issues. If you throw at them very complex reports and statistical analyses and whatnot, they're going to shut down automatically. That's not the way to reach people. I think people understand. This is since time immemorial, and since the era of hieroglyphics and all of that. People understand issues and each other through stories. And I think the more we're able to do that and to explain, here's how somebody in their community is doing something about climate change, I think that can go a long way. And I don't want to be, Pollyannish to say that's the one and only thing to do, but, giving people a different view of things, to say that, this isn't the end of the world or the end of the life that you once knew. That there are options, that there are, transitions do happen. And if it were easy, somebody already would have done it. But that doesn't mean that everything is going to be, dire and negative, that there is hope, that there is room for improvement. And how do we build a better, economy or whatever? I think, you take the small and bring it to the large, rather than taking the large and bringing it down to the small.
Thank you. God, I'm curious, as the person who has looked at hundreds of these stories, is there any sense from you on which stories, what is the sentiment of the stories that are being published and that are breaking through?
Um, what we describe in the report is that the discourse is darkening. It's really focused on rollbacks, and more skepticism about solutions. So there's definitely a dominant sentiment, at least in the five outlets that we looked at. But I would, that's in terms of sentiment. But again, is that I'm kind of repeating that point, but it's really important, is that the political and economic framing is really limiting in the way that we, engage with these policies and think about these policies. And they have been really limiting in that way. That skepticism, that darkening is really because of these narrow frames that have eliminated other ways that we can engage with policies, at least with the climate policies that we have looked at for this report.
Yeah. Hannah, Chris, anything else that you would add on tone? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll add something there just because, as I mentioned before about how this period has been really dark. It has been. And, so that is clearly, journalists are people, of course, a lot of journalists here, you're people, and, it's a feeling of total crisis that sometimes gets, filtered into reporting. And I think with that, though, there's this, as we're seeing, a loss of context in terms of how did we get here? There's, the clear reflection of this total crisis reality, but lack of clarity in terms of, the particular material, political, economic decisions that were made that led to this moment. And so for climate change, as Brent was saying too, it can be very overwhelming when it's just portrayed in that way without there being these responses or solutions or actions that people are tangibly taken, but also the clear, how did we get here? Because then the definition of it becomes clearer and more tangible. And, bringing in fossil fuels, like was mentioned in the report, and what decisions are being made now that are leading to growth of fossil fuels, which is going to lead to worsening climate change, and directing real tangible political responses to try to oppose that. And again, showing that there's collectives that want to oppose it as well. So the tone question in terms of avoiding the total crisis narrative, which is so, it is a crisis moment, but really trying to think about, I think, moving away from tone, the tone question of trying to move away from that as much as possible.
Chris?
Well, I think that different people respond in different ways, and this has been a debate, for the last 30 years. Is should we lean into fear? Should we lean into hope? And I think in some way the answer is just yes. It encompasses all of that. And but what I would say is that I think the key currency for communication nowadays is authenticity, right? Like past the days of the sort of the voice of God speaking on the evening news. And the only thing that people are really responding to, and is reason I think why YouTube, social media has so much traction, is that people feel like they're talking or hearing from a real person. So what's the most important thing in your communication is that level of authenticity, and if what freaks you out is the fact that we're maybe past the tipping point for the world's coral reefs and all kinds of other sort of global catastrophes are looming, then own it. And people will resonate who resonate. And if you're the kind of person who thinks it's about clean energy, growing at faster than any energy source ever has in the history of the world, and we just need to accelerate that, then own it, step into it. And the main point, I think, is to find what's authentic to you, because that's really the only thing now that's going to resonate with an audience.
All right. Well, that's a good way to segue, I think, into the last section before we move into closing here. Question for each of you. So Chris's key takeaway is authenticity. Maybe it's more than that, but I'm going to summarize it. Chris is authenticity. For you, Brent, what's your key takeaway for the folks on the webinar today?
Sorry, I just had a delay there for a sec. I mean, I think what we need to do in Canada is to focus on how do we build stronger communities of practice around these issues. I know, in the United States, we've got, covering climate now. In the United Kingdom, there's, the Reuters Institute runs, a coalition for journalists to come and, talk about climate change and how, share best practices and share information. I think that that's really important. And I think against that backdrop are two other small things that are very practical in their nature, just because I saw a couple questions in there that people were asking about practical solutions. I think obviously one is helping unearth or reveal independent sources that journalists can contact on deadline. Because of course, somebody who's has a particular, vested interest in advancing, one technology or one, source of energy or whatever, will be very amenable to having a conversation with a journalist. I think, the challenge is rebalancing that sort of landscape so that, independent sources are able to, there's a kind of a Rolodex, if you want to call it that, in the old fashioned way of understanding that journalists can call when they're on deadline, and they can provide some critical perspective and help journalists walk through some of this stuff, because maybe it's very technical and they need somebody to help them as well. I think the last thing that I think is a real takeaway is scientific literacy. Journalists, I think that's a skill. And I know journalists typically don't like numbers or science, and that's probably why they became a journalist in the first place. But I think, that's a very important ingredient if you are going to become a specialist in the environment or in climate change or resource extraction, anything like that, to really be able to match wits and to decipher what is accurate, what is fact from what is spin, in whether it's, politicians' statements or in independent quasi reports that are put out by various stakeholders.
Thanks, Brent. Hanna, and then the last word will go to you, Ghadah, and we'll sign off.
I'll keep mine quick, and just say to avoid assuming what the people think, in terms of, people are capable of caring more about than just economics, or perhaps actually that's losing people's interest. So just, I think a key takeaway is really thinking about people as more complex, multidimensional, talking to them, including their narratives, and not assuming what they think.
Thank you. And to you, Ghadah.
I mean, what everyone has said, but I want to, just probably emphasize two things. I think that what Brent just mentioned about public education and literacy, that is really important, and that work needs to be there's more work that needs to be done in educating the public through stories, through repeating actually some content. So that's one. And the other thing is that the way we look and work with the media, I think, is just it needs to be shifting a bit from looking from either, not saying to walk from traditional media, or, I see in the chat is like called corporate media or other names, but rather to look at it as an infrastructure. A whole infrastructure that we need to engage with. So traditional media and traditional journalism is needed for verified, timely information. And really, it's journalists who are needed for this work. But then also, we don't stop at pitching stories for traditional media, but then think about what is going to happen after that story gets published. How is it going to be recycled? How is it going to be reused, reshared? What's going to be our role in doing this? So to think of this structure and shifting the way that we engage, which means is like more work, more time for that kind of work. But you know, that shifting will really create some changes, I hope. And
yeah, thank you, Ghadah. So looking at the ecosystem and the work that we can do to move content between different platforms and what's effective in which space. Well, thank you. And I would also be so bold as to watch that because Re.Climate may have some exciting news coming up tied to that work. So once again, thank you to the panelists. I think that I found it very interesting. I also found the conversation interesting. We will share this recording. We will share the presentation with you soon. We have a follow-up survey. We really depend and rely on your feedback to improve the work that we're doing. So please take a look for that, and that will take the feedback. Yeah, okay. Once you leave the webinar, that will pop up. Thank you. And please sign up for Re.Climate if you haven't already. We produce a blog and we'll share some of the highlights there. And also we have lots of interesting work coming up this spring and that you'll want to keep track of. And if you have any questions about this or the webinar itself, you can always reach out to our colleague, Emma, who has been working behind the scenes. So thank you for everybody. Have a nice remainder of your day. Watch this space and we'll send out the report and the presentation and a recording to you very shortly. So thank you.